Before we begin, if this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because what Vivian Caldwell does next is something nobody saw coming. Not her husband, not the board, not the entire financial world that spent 15 years looking right through her. The flight from Geneva had taken 11 hours and 20 minutes, and Vivian Caldwell had spent most of it staring at a window full of dark Atlantic nothing, drinking black coffee she didn't taste, reading documents she already had memorized. The seat was wide enough to sleep in. She didn't sleep. She hadn't slept properly in 3 years, and she had stopped pretending that was going to change. She landed at JFK at 6:42 in the evening. The customs line was long. She stood in it without impatience, her carry-on pulled close, her coat folded over one arm. The woman behind her complained loudly about the wait, to no one in particular. Vivian said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that most human noise was not actually a request for response. The car service was waiting outside arrivals, the driver holding a sign that read Caldwell in block letters, though she had told him a dozen times over the years that the sign was unnecessary. She knew what she looked like. She knew what her own car looked like. But he was a cautious man, and caution was a quality she had come to respect more than almost anything else. "Mrs. Caldwell." He took her bag. "How long to Greenwich?" "Traffic's light tonight, maybe 40 minutes. She got into the car and pulled out her phone. There were 37 messages. She read none of them. There was one voicemail from her attorney, Natalia Mercer, marked urgent, and she listened to that one twice, sitting very still in the back seat while the city bled past the window in rivers of yellow and red. When the message ended, she put the phone face down on the seat beside her and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass. The woman looking back at her was 44 years old. She had good bones and tired eyes, and a jaw that people described, usually behind her back, as severe. She had heard that word applied to her so many times over the years, severe, that she had stopped noticing whether it was meant as insult or observation. It was simply what she was. She had not told Adrian she was coming home early. This was not an accident. The house in Greenwich was a thing Adrian had chosen, the way Adrian chose most things, for impact, for statement, for the impression it would leave on the people who drove past it or were invited inside it. 8,000 square feet of Connecticut colonial architecture, professionally landscaped, with a circular driveway that photographed beautifully and a foyer that echoed when you walked across it. Vivian had lived in it for 9 years, and she had never once felt that it belonged to her. The lights on the upper floor were on. She noticed that before the driver even stopped the car. She had been gone for 6 days. Adrian had known she was in Geneva. He had not called once, which was not unusual. They had moved past the pretense of checking in on each other sometime around their 12th year of marriage, when the checking in became too clearly a performance for both of them, and they quietly agreed, without ever saying so, to stop performing it. She paid the driver in cash, told him not to wait, and walked to the front door with her carry-on behind her. The house was not locked. It was never locked when Adrian was home, a habit that had always irritated her for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate. Something about the arrogance of a man who believed so completely that nothing bad would ever reach him. She stepped inside. The foyer was dark. The living room was dark. The kitchen light was on, faintly, the way it was always left on when the housekeeper had gone for the evening. She set her bag down at the bottom of the stairs. She could hear something from the upper floor. Music, low. Something instrumental she didn't recognize. Adrian's taste in music had always run toward the theatrical, toward things with too much production and not enough restraint. She climbed the stairs. Later, she would not be able to reconstruct exactly what she felt in those 20 seconds between the bottom step and the bedroom door. Not dread. She was not a woman who felt dread in the conventional sense. Not anticipation. Something flatter than either of those. Something closer to the feeling she got when she was reading a financial report and a number appeared that she had already, in some quiet corner of her mind, expected to find there. She opened the bedroom door. Adrian was there. Of course he was. He was sitting up in bed, shirtless, and there was a woman beside him. Younger, dark-haired, tangled in the sheet in the way of someone who had recently stopped moving. The woman made a sound. Adrian looked up. For one full second, nobody moved. Vivian's eyes went to the woman's ears. The emerald earrings were small and old, set in yellow gold, shaped like teardrops. They had belonged to Vivian's mother, who had worn them every day of her adult life until the day she was too sick to get out of bed. Vivian had kept them in a velvet box in her jewelry drawer for 11 years. She had worn them twice, once on the day of her mother's funeral, and once on the night she and Adrian had closed the Mercer acquisition, which was the first deal she had architected from start to finish, and which had made them both, for the first time, genuinely wealthy. She had not worn them since. She had not given anyone permission to wear them. The cold that moved through her chest was not grief. It was something more precise than grief. It was the sensation of a last remaining illusion dissolving so cleanly that you could almost hear it go. She crossed the room. The woman scrambled. Adrian said her name, Vivian. In the voice he used when he was buying time, the voice she had heard him use with investors and board members and subordinates when he needed a moment to construct a position. She had spent 15 years watching him buy time. She knew every variation of that voice. She did not look at him. She stood in front of the woman, who had pressed herself against the headboard, sheet pulled to her collarbone, and who was now looking at Vivian with an expression caught between guilt and a very young kind of defiance. Vivian said, "Take them off." Her voice was level, not quiet from restraint, simply level, the way a reading on an instrument is level when there is no variation to report. The woman looked at Adrian. "Take them off," Vivian said again. The woman reached up with shaking hands and removed the earrings and held them out. Vivian took them. She held them in her palm for a moment. They were warm from the woman's skin, and this detail registered somewhere beneath language, somewhere in the body. And then she closed her fingers around them and walked out of the room. She heard Adrian get up behind her. She heard him pull on something, follow her into the hallway. "Vivian, let me—" "Don't. If you'll just—" She turned around. He stopped. She looked at him standing there in the hallway of their 8,000-square-foot house, barefoot, dressed in the clothes he had grabbed in 30 seconds, and she recognized him with a clarity that should have arrived much sooner, and hadn't, because she had spent 15 years being useful to him, and usefulness has a way of making you patient with things that should not be tolerated. "I'm not doing this tonight," she said. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to sleep in the guest room. She can leave." "Vivian?" "She can leave now, Adrian, or I can call someone who will ensure she leaves. Either way, by the time I come out of the bathroom, she's gone." She went to the guest room at the end of the hall and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment, her fists still closed around the earrings. Her breathing was controlled. Her heart rate was elevated, but not dramatically so. She could feel it, the slight hammer of it in her sternum, and she noted it the way she noted everything, as data. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her hand and looked at the earrings in the dark. Her mother's name had been Eleanor. She had been a high school mathematics teacher in Hartford for 31 years, which was considered a modest career by the standards of the world Vivian now occupied, but which Vivian privately regarded as one of the most sustained and serious intellectual commitments she had ever witnessed. Eleanor had been precise and unsentimental, and she had believed, with a steadiness that never wavered, that rigorous thinking was the most important gift a person could develop. She had died of a stroke at 68, in a hospital room in New Haven, with Vivian holding one hand and the television on in the corner playing something neither of them watched. Adrian had not been there. He had been in Singapore for a deal that did not close. Vivian set the earrings on the nightstand and lay down on top of the covers without undressing. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. Not because she had hardened, she did not think she had hardened, not exactly, but because crying required a particular kind of surprise, a gap between what you expected and what arrived, and she had been expecting this moment, in one form or another, for longer than she could now clearly remember. She had been preparing for it. That was the part Adrian did not know. In the morning, the other woman was gone. Vivian knew this before she opened her door, the way you can know the temperature of a room before you step into it. The house had a different quality of silence, the silence of two people rather than three. She showered, dressed, and went downstairs. Adrian was in the kitchen, in a suit, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee. He was not drinking. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed a speech overnight and was no longer certain it was the right speech. She poured herself coffee and stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island. I want to explain, he said. You don't need to. Vivian, I'm not angry, Adrian. She said it simply, and it was true. I'm done. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the beginning of a recalibration. Done meaning I'm leaving, I want a divorce. He set his coffee cup down. You're reacting. She looked at him. Excuse me? You flew in last night. You were exhausted. You saw something. I saw my mother's earrings on another woman's ears in my bedroom. She kept her voice even. I'm not reacting. I've been thinking about this for 3 years. What happened last night made the timing clearer, that's all. He was quiet for a moment. Adrian Whitmore was not a stupid man. This was something she had always had to hold on to when she felt contempt for him. He was not stupid. He was vain and self-serving and had convinced himself over the years that his public success was entirely the product of his own genius, which was a delusion so complete and so consistently reinforced by the world around him that she sometimes thought even he could be forgiven for believing it. But he was not stupid. He could read a room. He could read a person. And something in her stillness this morning was telling him that this was not what he had been prepared for. 3 years, he said. Yes. You've been planning to leave for 3 years. Planning isn't the right word. She drank her coffee. I've been making sure I could. He absorbed this. What does that mean? It means call your lawyer, Adrian, because I've already called mine. She left the kitchen before he could respond, went to the guest room, and began packing. She was efficient about it. She knew what she needed and what she didn't. The things that mattered to her were not things. The earrings now in her coat pocket, a photograph of her mother that she kept in her travel bag, a notebook she had been filling since the beginning of all this, dense with numbers and dates and names that would matter later. Everything else in this house could be argued over by their attorneys. She was outside with her 2 suitcases within 40 minutes. Adrian came to the front door. Where are you staying? My attorneys arranged something. Vivian, we need to talk about the company. She stopped, turned around. He was standing in the doorway of the house they had shared, in the suit he had put on to suggest that everything was still normal, and for the first time in a long time she felt something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. He had built his entire identity around Whitmore Capital. The company was not something he had. It was something he was. And he was beginning, she could see, to understand that she knew something about his company that he had never adequately considered. Call your lawyer, she said again, and tell him to take it seriously this time. She got into the car that Natalia had sent. The driveway curved away from the house, and she did not look back. Natalia Mercer had an office in Midtown Manhattan on the 31st floor of a building that charged rents that most attorneys would never be able to afford, which was Natalia's way of communicating something specific to the people who came to see her. She had been practicing corporate and family law for 22 years, and she had the reputation, not universal, but durable, of being the attorney you called when you were serious. Vivian had called her 3 years ago. The meeting that morning lasted 4 hours. They sat across from each other at a conference table with 2 associates taking notes, and Vivian walked through everything she had documented: the structural position of her ownership stake, the record she had maintained of her contributions to key decisions, the correspondence she had preserved with investors and advisors over 15 years, the materials she had organized over 3 years of careful, quiet preparation. He's going to move to challenge the stake, Natalia said. She had said this before. She was saying it now because it was closer to real. Let him. It's going to get loud. I know. The board is going to panic. Some of them, not all. Vivian set a folder on the table. These 3 will not panic. I've spoken with them, without specifics, over the past year. They know what the review will find. Natalia opened the folder and read for a moment without expression. You've been doing this methodically. Yes. He has no idea. Vivian said, he never looked. This was the thing that she had lived with for 3 years, the thing that was most difficult to explain to people who had not been inside the architecture of a life like hers. It wasn't that Adrian had hidden from the truth of her contribution. It was that he had never considered it necessary to look. She had been so reliable, so consistently present, so effective in the spaces behind the visible that he had come to treat her work the way people treat infrastructure, not with malice, but with a comprehensive lack of curiosity about how it functioned. You don't think about the pipes until the water stops. She had spent 15 years being the pipes. How quickly can we initiate the governance review? She asked. Natalia looked at her associate, who flipped to a page in his legal pad. If we file this week, we can expect the formal notice to reach the board by Friday. After that, it's the board's timeline. Move as quickly as the process allows. Vivian, Natalia set the folder down. I want to make sure you understand that this is going to be public. Not immediately, but within weeks. The financial press is going to cover it. Good. Natalia paused. It was a measured pause, the kind she deployed when she wanted to signal that what followed was not merely professional advice. You've been carrying this for 3 years. Is there any part of you that wants to consider a private settlement first? Let me approach his team. No. It would be cleaner. For whom? Vivian looked at her. I'm not doing this for a settlement, Natalia. I don't need his money. I have money. I'm doing this because 15 years of work deserves to be on the record. She picked up her coffee cup. File this week. Natalia nodded. Okay. The apartment Natalia had arranged for her was in the West Village, a furnished 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a brownstone that belonged to one of Natalia's clients, who was currently in London. It was quiet and modest by the standards Vivian had lived in for years, which meant it was exactly the right size for one person, with good light in the mornings and bookshelves that someone else had filled with books Vivian had not read. She unpacked her 2 suitcases in 20 minutes. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and a glass of water, and she began to organize what the next several weeks were going to look like. She was good at this, at taking a large and complex situation and reducing it to its sequential components. It was the skill that had made her irreplaceable inside Whitmore Capital. It was the skill that was now going to be used entirely in service of herself. Her phone buzzed. Adrian. She declined the call. It buzzed again. She turned it face down and kept writing. Adrian Whitmore spent the remainder of that week doing what he always did when he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He talked to people. He called his 3 closest advisors. He had lunch with his attorney, a man named Greer, who had handled his personal legal matters for over a decade and who had, in Vivian's private estimation, never once given him genuinely difficult news. He made calls to board members in careful, casual tones, as though he were simply checking in. He did not call Vivian again until Thursday. She answered this time. You filed with the board, he said. No preamble. His voice had the particular edge of a man who has just discovered that something he thought was theoretical is actual. Yes. You're initiating a governance review over the ownership structure. Yes. Vivian. The edge sharpened. You realize what you're doing to the company. I'm not doing anything to the company. I'm asking the company to examine itself accurately. The timing is my choice. Silence. This is about last night, he said. She was patient with this. She had been patient with him for 15 years. She had a few more weeks of patience left before it became someone else's problem. Adrian, I told you this morning that I've been thinking about this for 3 years. Last night didn't cause this. It just ended the question of when. You're trying to punish me. No. She said it without heat. If I wanted to punish you, I would have done this 3 years ago when I was still angry. I'm past anger. I want the record corrected. The record? He said it as though it were an abstraction. The record of who built what? She paused. Have Greer call Natalia, and tell him please to actually prepare this time. She ended the call. The governance review notice reached the board on Friday morning, as Natalia had predicted. By Friday afternoon, Vivian had received 5 calls from board members. She returned 3 of them, the 3 she had already spoken with informally, the 3 whose private assessments of the company's history she had reason to trust. The calls were brief and careful, and they confirmed what she had suspected. The The board was not unified behind Adrian the way he believed it was. There were members who had known, for years, that the company's strategic intelligence did not originate solely with the man presenting it. There were members who had filed this knowledge away in the compartment reserved for things that are true but inconvenient to acknowledge in public. The review was giving them permission to stop pretending. The first press mention appeared on the following Tuesday. It was a single paragraph in a financial news column, buried after the main stories, written in the carefully hedged language of a journalist who has confirmed something through one source and is waiting to confirm it through a second. It described a governance review at Whitmore Capital and noted that it had been initiated by a major stakeholder. It did not name Vivian. By Wednesday, 2 more publications had picked it up. By Thursday, her name was in print. The story, as it emerged across those first 2 weeks, was not the story of a bitter divorce. The journalists who were good at their jobs, and some of them were, understood quickly that the document trail was too extensive for this to be emotional. The ownership stake was real, verifiable, recorded. The communications were organized. The witnesses, former executives, risk analysts, advisors, were not people who could be dismissed as partisans. She was not performing grief. She was presenting evidence. Adrian's public response was controlled. He made no direct comment about Vivian, which was the right tactical decision, and which Vivian respected even as she recognized it as purely tactical. His spokesperson characterized the review as a routine corporate matter being handled through appropriate channels. His attorney sent a letter suggesting in formal language that a private discussion between the parties might resolve things more efficiently. Natalia forwarded the letter to Vivian with a one-line note. "Your call." Vivian wrote back, "Tell them we'll speak when they have something real to offer." Bond. It was during the 3rd week that Daniel Holt called her. Daniel had been a risk analyst at Whitmore Capital for 7 years, the last 2 of which he had spent as a consultant after what the company publicly described as a mutual parting of ways. Vivian knew him. She had worked with him closely during one of the most critical periods of the company's history, a period that Adrian had later described publicly as having been navigated entirely by his own leadership. "I saw the news," Daniel said. "I assumed you might. I want to give a statement." She was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, you don't need to do that." "I want to." His voice was steady. She had always respected his steadiness. "I've been sitting on what I know for 2 years, and I'm tired of sitting on it. I have emails, Vivian. I have analysis documents that have your name on them. I have a record of what actually happened during the Carrington restructuring." The Carrington restructuring, 4 years ago. The deal that Adrian had used as the centerpiece of the speech he gave at the Morrison Financial Dinner the following year. The speech that had been featured in 3 separate profile pieces about his strategic genius. "Let me have Natalia contact you," she said. "I'll talk to anyone you want me to talk to." She hung up and sat very still for a moment. She had not asked Daniel to come forward. She had not asked any of them, and yet they were coming, one by one, because they had watched from the inside for years, and they had their own private accounting that had never been squared. 3 weeks after the night she walked out, Vivian was sitting at the kitchen table in the West Village apartment with the morning light falling across her notebook when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered. The voice on the other end was older, deliberate, with the particular cadence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where people listened when he spoke. "Mrs. Caldwell," the man said, "this is Robert Ellison. I believe you knew my father." Marcus Ellison, the architect of 3 decades of financial institutions. The man who had taken one meeting with Vivian 11 years ago and had told her, at the end of it, that she was the most precise strategic thinker he had encountered in 15 years of investing. The man who had written a letter shortly before his death 8 months ago that his son was now calling to tell her about. "Mr. Ellison," she said. "My father left instructions," Robert said. "There was a letter. He wrote it 2 years ago, and he told me it should only be relevant if something like what's currently happening happened." A pause. "I think it's relevant now." Vivian's hand was steady on the phone, but something in her chest, something she had been holding closed for 3 years with the discipline of a woman who could not afford to feel it yet, shifted. I'd like to read it, she said. I know, Robert Ellison said. That's why I'm calling. The morning light kept moving across the table. Somewhere outside, the city was doing what cities do. Continuous, indifferent, enormous. Vivian sat in the quiet of a borrowed apartment, wearing her mother's earrings, and understood that the next chapter had already begun. The letter arrived by courier the following morning. Robert Ellison had not sent a scan, not an email attachment, not a photograph taken with a phone. He had sent the original, sealed in a heavy cream envelope with his father's initials embossed in the upper left corner, the kind of stationery that communicated something specific about the man who had chosen it. Vivian signed for it at the door of the West Village apartment in her robe, her coffee in her other hand, and she stood in the doorway for a moment after the courier left, turning the envelope over once before she went inside. She did not open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen table and finished her coffee standing at the window, watching the street below where a woman was walking a large dog that was pulling hard against its leash in the direction of something the woman couldn't see. She watched them until they turned the corner. Then she sat down, set her coffee cup aside, and opened the envelope. Marcus Ellison's handwriting was small and extremely precise, the handwriting of a man who had trained himself out of any excess. The letter was 4 pages, written in black ink on the same cream paper as the envelope, and it was dated 22 months before his death. She read it once quickly and then sat back and breathed. Then she read it again slowly. Marcus had written it without sentimentality, which was what she would have expected from him. He had laid out, in the compressed and orderly way of a man accustomed to writing investment memos, what he had observed over the course of his relationship with Whitmore Capital. The meetings he had attended, the conversations he had held, the negotiations he had watched unfold in rooms where both Vivian and Adrian were present, and the negotiations where only Vivian had been present, conducting business on behalf of a company that did not publicly acknowledge her role. He had written specifically about the rescue package, the one that had kept Whitmore Capital solvent during the liquidity crisis of 8 years ago, when the markets had contracted violently and 2 of their largest investors had pulled commitments within the same week, and Adrian had been in the Maldives and had not understood, for the first 48 hours, how serious it was. Vivian had understood in the first hour. She had spent 72 hours on the phone, calling in relationships she had spent a decade building, negotiating terms on the fly, working with numbers on a legal pad at the kitchen table of the Greenwich House, while Adrian flew back and held a confident press call about the company's stability. The deal that stabilized the company had been hers. Every term of it. Marcus Ellison had been one of the people she called. He had come through with a commitment that was not the largest, but was the one that stopped the bleeding, because Marcus's name on a term sheet had a symbolic weight that translated immediately into the confidence of others. She had called him at 11 at night, and he had listened to her for 4 minutes without interruption, and then he had said simply, "Send me the terms." He had never been asked to deny his involvement. That was not the issue. The issue was that when Adrian told the story of how the company survived that period, Marcus's name appeared in the narrative as someone Adrian had personally cultivated, a long-standing relationship, a testament to his own network. Vivian's name did not appear at all. Marcus had written in the letter, "I allowed this omission to stand for too long. Not because I believed it was accurate, but because the business of finance tends to reward the visible and ignore the structural, and I was not immune to that tendency. I am writing this now because I have reason to believe the accurate account will matter eventually, and I want the accurate account to exist." She set the letter down. Her hands were not shaking. She noted this with a detached interest, that her hands were not shaking, that her breathing was controlled, that the primary sensation in her chest was not grief or vindication, but something more like the feeling of a proof completing itself on a page. The kind of feeling that arrives not when something surprising happens, but when something true is finally confirmed. She called Natalia. "The Ellison letter exists," she said when Natalia picked up. A pause. "You have it." "I have it. Original. 4 pages. He details the rescue package specifically." She could hear Natalia setting something down on her desk. "Vivian, I know what it is." His testimony would have been enough. The letter is, "I know. Another pause. When Natalia spoke again, her voice had the particular quality of a lawyer who is recalibrating the scale of something. When can you bring it in? This afternoon. I'll clear my schedule. Well, Adrian found out about the letter on a Wednesday. Vivian did not tell him. She did not know who did. Someone in the financial press who had a source inside the Ellison family's business circle, most likely, because within 24 hours of the letter being referenced in the governance review documents, 2 financial journalists had called Natalia's office asking for comment. Natalia gave no comment. This was the right move. The absence of a denial was its own communication. Adrian called Vivian at 8 in the morning. The Ellison letter, he said. Good morning. Don't. His voice was different now. The careful performance of calm was gone. What was underneath it was not rage exactly. Adrian had never been a man whose emotions ran hot, which was one of the things she had once found compelling about him and had later come to understand as something more like an absence. I need to know what's in it. Speak to Natalia. I'm speaking to you. Adrian, 15 years. He said it differently than she had said it, differently than most people said numbers, not as a measure of time, but as a thing that had weight, that had pressed down on him overnight and was still pressing. 15 years and you're going to use Marcus Ellison's letter to dismantle everything we built. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? She was standing at the window again, the phone held loosely to her ear, watching the street. A man in a delivery uniform was stacking boxes on a hand truck with a concentrated efficiency that she found, for a moment, completely absorbing. I'm asking the record to reflect what happened, that's all. The record. He said it the same way he had said it before, as though it were a concept he was still trying to locate in space. You want to burn this company down for the record. The company isn't burning. The company is being examined. The stock dropped 4% yesterday. I know. You know. A sound that was not quite a laugh. You're watching it. Of course I'm watching it. And you're fine with it. I'm not celebrating it, Adrian. She turned away from the window. But a 4% drop in a governance review is normal market behavior. You know that. Greer knows that. If the company's fundamentals are what you've always claimed they are, it recovers. Silence. Tell me what's in the letter, he said. Quieter now. The question underneath the question was audible. Call Natalia. She ended the call. She had not expected to feel it that afternoon. She was sitting in Natalia's conference room for a meeting with 2 of the board members who had agreed to speak with her directly. Helen Cho, who had been on the board for 6 years and whose caution Vivian had always respected, and a man named Paul Ryder, who had joined 3 years ago and who brought with him a background in corporate governance that made him the right person to have in this particular room. The meeting was substantive and professional. They went through documents. They discussed the structure of the review. They talked about timelines. And then Helen Cho set down her pen and looked at Vivian across the table and said, I want to ask you something that isn't strictly related to the process. Go ahead. How long did you know that your role wasn't being recognized? The room was very quiet. Paul Ryder had stopped writing. Natalia, seated beside Vivian, was still. Vivian thought about the question carefully before she answered it, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give the accurate one, rather than the one that was most emotionally coherent. I knew it was minimized from the beginning, she said. Early on, I told myself it was temporary, that as the company grew and our position became more secure, the public narrative would catch up with the reality. She paused. It didn't. When did you stop expecting it to? About 6 years ago. She said it without difficulty, but she heard it as she said it. 6 years. And something in her chest registered the length of that number. There was a profile piece in a major publication. Adrian was on the cover. The interviewer had spoken to multiple people inside the company, and the piece mentioned me twice, both times in reference to Adrian. Someone asked him about my role directly. She stopped. What did he say? Helen asked. He said I was his most important sounding board. Helen Cho absorbed this. Paul Ryder made a small sound, not quite a word. A sounding board, Helen said. Yes. Not a strategist, not a partner. A sounding board. The silence in the room had a different quality after that, Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the silence that follows a statement that says more about a situation than any argument could. Daniel Holt gave his statement the following week. He gave it to the Governance Review Committee's counsel in a conference room downtown, in the presence of his own attorney, for 3 hours. Vivian was not present. This had been Natalia's advice, and she had agreed with it. Her presence would have colored the account, given Adrian's team grounds to characterize it as coordinated rather than independent. Daniel's account needed to stand as its own. She read the summary that evening. He had been thorough. He had brought emails, internal documents, analysis records with date stamps and metadata that placed Vivian at the origin of several decisions that had subsequently been presented publicly by Adrian without attribution. The Carrington restructuring was the centerpiece, but there were others, smaller, specific, the kind of detail that accumulates into a pattern that is difficult to dispute precisely because of its granularity. What struck her most was a line near the end of Daniel's statement, which Natalia had marked with a small, handwritten note in the margin. He said, and I am quoting directly, "When I had a question I couldn't answer, I went to Vivian. When Adrian had a question he couldn't answer, he also went to Vivian. The difference was that he didn't tell people that's what he was doing." She read that line twice, set the summary on the table, looked at it for a while. There was something she had not let herself feel very much throughout this entire process, because feeling it would have made the process harder. She had been good at converting it into forward motion, but in the quiet of the apartment, reading a direct quote from a man who had simply said the true thing, she let herself feel it for approximately 90 seconds. It was not grief. It was not anger. It was the exhaustion of having been competent in the dark for a very long time. 90 seconds. She breathed through it. Then she picked up her notebook and began writing the next set of tasks. The call from Greer, Adrian's attorney, came on a Friday. Natalia sat across from Vivian in the conference room, her phone on speaker between them, while Greer's voice filled the room with the particular cadence of a man who believed that delivery could compensate for the weakness of what was being delivered. "My client would like to propose a comprehensive resolution," Greer said. "Given the significance of Mrs. Caldwell's contribution to the company, which my client has always privately acknowledged." Natalia caught Vivian's eye. The word privately hung in the air between them. "He is prepared to offer a settlement that reflects that contribution substantially. The figure we have in mind is—" He named a number. It was a large number. It was the kind of number that most attorneys, in most situations, would have expected to end a conversation. Vivian looked at the phone on the table. Then she looked at Natalia. "The settlement would include," Greer continued, "a mutual non-disclosure component and a joint public statement characterizing the resolution as an amicable—" "Stop," Natalia said. Greer stopped. "My client's position has not changed. We are not discussing settlement terms that include any non-disclosure component. The figure is irrelevant if it comes attached to silence." Natalia kept her voice level. "If your client wants to have a conversation about resolution, we're available. But that conversation starts with the public record, not with burying it." A pause from Greer's end. When he spoke again, the delivery had shifted fractionally. Something underneath the professional surface had registered. "I want to be clear that my client considers this offer to be extremely—" "I understand," Natalia said. "We'll be in touch." She ended the call. The room was quiet for a moment. "He didn't expect that," Vivian said. "No." Natalia leaned back in her chair. "He thought the number would close it." Adrian thought the number would close it. "Yes." Vivian looked at her hands on the table. "He still doesn't understand." "What do you mean?" "He thinks this is about leverage, about extracting maximum value." She looked up. "He's been in finance long enough to believe that everything is ultimately a negotiation about price, that there's a number for everything." She paused. "He never understood that some things aren't for sale." Natalia studied her. "Are you sure? Because the number was significant." "I know what the number was. And I don't want to be paid to disappear, Natalia." She said it without heat, but with a finality that closed the question. "I want the work to be on the record. I want the people who come after me, women who are doing what I did, who are being used the way I was used, to be able to point to something, to say, This happened, it was documented, and there were consequences. She picked up her pen. That's what I want. Tell me what's next. What was next arrived faster than either of them had anticipated. On a Tuesday morning, 17 days after Greer's settlement call, the Governance Review Committee released a preliminary finding. It was not the full finding, that would take additional weeks. But the preliminary finding stated, in the dry, careful language of formal corporate process, that evidence submitted to the review supported a material re-examination of the attribution of strategic contribution to Whitmore Capital's key decisions over the preceding decade, and that this re-examination would proceed with full committee authority. It was one paragraph. It had no names in it, but everyone in the financial community who read it knew exactly what it meant. Vivian was in the West Village apartment when Natalia called with the news. She was at the kitchen table with her notebook and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and she listened to Natalia read the paragraph aloud, and she said, "Okay." And after the call ended, she sat in the quiet for a long time. The preliminary finding was not the end. It wasn't even close to the end. There was still the full review, the board vote on its recommendations, the public statement that would eventually need to be issued, the divorce proceedings that were proceeding in parallel on a separate legal track with their own timeline and their own complications. There was still Adrian. She was thinking about this, about the particular quality of what was still to come, when her phone rang again. Not Natalia this time. A number she recognized. She stared at it for 2 rings. Then she answered. "I read the preliminary finding," Adrian said. His voice was different from any version of it she had heard in the past weeks. Not the controlled performance of the early morning call, not the suppressed urgency of the conversation about Marcus Ellison's letter. Something else. Something she needed a moment to identify. He sounded tired. Not the tactical tiredness of a man who wants to seem vulnerable. The other kind. The kind that arrives when a person has been fighting a version of reality for long enough that the fighting itself has become exhausting. "I know," she said. "I need to see you." She waited. Not with lawyers, not for strategy. He stopped. She could hear him breathing on the other end, steady but effortful, like a man who has been walking uphill for a long time. "I need to see you, Vivian." She looked at the window. The afternoon light was going bronze, the way it did in October in the city, warm and slightly elegiac. "Wednesday," she said. "Afternoon. A public place." "Name it." She told him a cafe in the Flatiron she had been to twice since the beginning of all this, a place quiet enough for conversation and public, enough to make performance necessary for both of them. Then she ended the call and sat with the bronze light on the table and her cold coffee and the silence of a city that did not care, one way or the other, what happened next. She had agreed to see him. She had been careful, for 3 years, not to let her clarity about the situation become something harder than clarity, not to let the preparation become hatred. Hatred would have made her careless, and she could not afford careless. But she was aware, sitting there, that seeing Adrian face to face, not in a boardroom context, not through attorneys, but simply as 2 people who had shared 15 years of a life, was going to require something from her that the documents and the legal strategy had not. She picked up her pen. She wrote in her notebook, "Wednesday. Be precise. Be fair. Don't mistake exhaustion for change." She underlined the last 4 words. Then she closed the notebook and went to make more coffee and stood at the window watching the street go dark, aware that somewhere across the city, in the 8,000-square-foot house she had never felt was hers, a man was sitting with the knowledge that the foundation beneath him had shifted in a way that no settlement offer and no legal strategy was going to fix. Because the thing that had shifted was not a legal position. It was the truth. And the truth, once it is in motion, does not negotiate. The cafe was called Meridian, and it occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on 23rd Street that had been a bookstore in a previous life and still had the bones of one. Deep shelves along the walls now holding plants instead of volumes. The pressed tin ceiling painted the color of old paper. Vivian arrived 8 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, not because she was hiding, but because she wanted to see the door from where she sat. She ordered black coffee and did not look at her phone. Adrian came in at exactly the agreed time, which told her something. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, charcoal gray, well cut. He had lost some weight in the past weeks. She noticed this the way she noticed everything about him. Automatically, involuntarily, the way the eye goes to a familiar object, even when you've decided you're done looking at it. He saw her and came directly to the table without stopping at the counter. He sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table, not reaching for anything, just setting them there. It was an oddly exposing gesture for a man who normally kept his body carefully composed. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You asked." A waiter appeared. Adrian ordered coffee without looking at the menu. Then they were alone again, and the cafe noise settled around them, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She had been right about what it would require. Sitting across from him in a place with no attorneys and no documents between them, she was aware of the full texture of 15 years pressing against the present moment. Not sentimentally, not with longing, but with the specific weight of time that has been genuinely lived. They had not been unhappy for all of it. She wanted to be accurate about that. Even now, there had been years that were good. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you," Adrian said. "Take your time." "I've had time, that's the problem." He looked down at his hands. "I've had 3 weeks of time and I still don't know how to—" He stopped, looked up. "When did I stop seeing you?" She held the question in her mind for a moment. "You stopped seeing me before you stopped being grateful. That's the order it happened in." "What does that mean?" "It means that for a few years, you knew you were taking credit for things that weren't solely yours. You knew and you justified it to yourself. Because the company was growing and the press was responding and the board was pleased and the justification was easy." She turned her coffee cup on the saucer once, slowly. "And then at some point you stopped even needing the justification. It had simply become the story. You told it enough times that you believed it." He absorbed this without flinching, which surprised her slightly. There had been a version of this conversation she had imagined in which he argued, in which the defensiveness that had characterized so much of the past 3 weeks reasserted itself. But he sat with what she'd said, and the sitting with it was its own kind of acknowledgement. "The Ellison letter," he said. "I want to ask you, not for legal reasons. I want to know what Marcus said." She looked at him. "You want me to tell you?" "Yes." "Ask Natalia to share the document through proper channels." "Vivian, that's not obstruction, Adrian. That's me telling you that if you want the truth, it should come to you through a process that makes it real, not as something I describe to you over coffee." She paused. "You've been managing the truth for 15 years. The point of all of this is that it stops being managed." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside on the street, a truck went past, and the window glass vibrated faintly in its frame. "I told Greer to stand down on the settlement offer," he said. She went still. "I told him 2 days ago, we're not pursuing the settlement in the form he presented it." He met her eyes. "The non-disclosure component was wrong. I knew it was wrong when he proposed it. I let him propose it anyway because I wasn't—" He stopped again. The halting quality of his speech was unfamiliar to her. Adrian Whitmore was not a man who halted. "I wasn't ready yet, to say it out loud." "To say what?" "That you're right." He said it simply, without the preparation of a man who has polished a statement. That the record is wrong, that it needs to be corrected. The cafe noise continued around them, indifferent and complete. Someone at a nearby table was laughing at something on their phone. The waiter was moving between tables with a tray. Vivian looked at the man across from her. The man she had married at 29 in a garden in Connecticut. The man whose hand she had held while they signed documents that built something real. The man who had taken what she built and over years had slowly, without cruelty and without design, but with absolute thoroughness, made it invisible. And she felt the thing she had been most careful not to feel. Not love, not anymore, but something that had grown in the same soil as love and was therefore difficult to distinguish from it at the root level. The knowledge of a person so complete that even their failures are comprehensible. "I believe you," she said, but believing you is not the same as stopping the process." She held his gaze. "This isn't about you and me anymore, Adrian. It was, at the beginning, but it isn't now. It's about the record." He nodded, not quickly. Slowly, the way a person nods when they are actually absorbing something, rather than performing acknowledgement. "I know," he said. They sat for a few more minutes and drank their coffee and talked about logistics. The Greenwich House, the timeline, the board meeting that was scheduled for the following month. It was the conversation of two people who had once run a complex operation together and still knew how to speak the language of process even when everything else had changed. When they stood to leave, Adrian held her coat for her. It was an automatic gesture, a 15-year habit of the body. She put the coat on and turned around and looked at him. "You were my most important sounding board," she said. "That's what you told the journalist." Something crossed his face. Not quite shame, something more layered. "I know what I said. I want you to know that I remember it." She buttoned the coat, "Not to punish you, because it matters that you know I remember it." She walked out. She was half a block away, moving with the current of pedestrian traffic, when her phone rang. Natalia. She answered. "Where are you?" Natalia's voice had a quality she did not use often, tight, controlled, the voice she used when she was managing information that required careful handling before release. 23rd Street. What happened? "I need you in my office. Now." Natalia. "Not on the phone, Vivian." Something moved through her. Not panic. Vivian did not panic. But something colder than her usual equanimity, something that recognized the quality of Natalia's voice as the kind of voice that precedes information that changes the shape of things. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. Well, Natalia met her in the reception area, which she had never done before. She took Vivian by the arm. Not dramatically, just the hand on the arm of a person who needs to be moved with some directness, and walked her down the hall to the smaller conference room, not the main one where they usually worked. Her two associates were not present. Natalia closed the door and sat down and put a folder on the table and did not open it immediately. "Tell me," Vivian said. "This came in 2 hours ago from the review committee's counsel." Natalia opened the folder. They were doing standard document discovery, pulling the full historical record of the ownership structure, the cap table, the original incorporation documents. She turned a page and set it in front of Vivian. They found something. Vivian looked at the document. It was a legal instrument, dated 11 years ago, an amendment to the shareholder agreement. She had not seen it before. She was certain she had not seen it because she was certain of every document in the ownership structure of Whitmore Capital, the way a person is certain of the contents of their own home. She read it. Then she read it again. The cold that moved through her was different from the cold of the night she had walked into the bedroom. That cold had been clean. This was something more complex, something with edges. The amendment contained a provision, nested in Section 7, subsection C, the kind of location where provisions go when someone does not want them found quickly, that placed specific conditions on the exercise of her 38% ownership stake in the event of a marital dissolution. The conditions were elaborate and specifically constructed. They did not eliminate her stake, but they created a legal mechanism by which the exercise of active governance authority, the authority she was currently invoking through the review, could be suspended pending a determination by the existing board majority. The board majority that Adrian's allies still controlled. If the provision was enforced, the governance review she had initiated could be legally paused. The preliminary findings could be placed in procedural suspension. The momentum of the past 3 weeks, the statements, the documents, Marcus Ellison's letter, Daniel Holt's testimony, could be frozen in place while lawyers argued about the validity of a clause that had been buried in an amendment for 11 years. She looked up from the document. "I didn't sign this," she said. Natalia's expression did not change, but something in it confirmed what Vivian had said before she answered. "Your signature is on it. I'm telling you I did not sign this document. I believe you." Natalia said it immediately, without qualification. "Which is why I need you to tell me about the amendment process 11 years ago. Anything you remember." 11 years ago. She sat with the date. 11 years ago, they had been in the middle of the company's third significant growth phase, the one that had brought in a wave of new institutional investors and required a comprehensive restructuring of the governance documents. There had been dozens of amendments, dozens of documents, a period of 4 months during which she had signed things on a near-daily basis, trusting the legal team to have reviewed and flagged anything that required her specific attention. The legal team that had been assembled and overseen by Adrian. She understood what she was looking at. "Who was the attorney who drafted the amendment?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was working very hard to keep it level. Natalia turned to another page. The firm was Harwick and Cole. Vivian looked at her. Harwick and Cole had been Whitmore Capital's primary outside counsel for corporate matters for 12 years. They were also, she now recalled with a precision that arrived like a physical sensation, the firm that had recommended Greer to Adrian as personal legal counsel 18 months ago. "Do they still represent the company?" she asked. "They were replaced 14 months ago. New firm came in when the board restructured the outside counsel relationships." Natalia paused. 14 months ago. 2 months before Vivian had first spoken to Natalia. 4 months before she had begun formally organizing the documentation for the process that was now underway. She sat very still. The timeline was doing something in her mind, arranging itself the way timelines do when you introduce a new piece of information, reshaping, recontextualizing, the way a familiar room looks different when you move a single piece of furniture. "He knew," she said. Natalia was quiet. "He knew I was considering this. Somehow. Before I had spoken to you, before I had done anything formal, he knew I was considering action." She looked at the document in front of her. "And he changed the outside counsel before I moved, so that when the amendment was discovered, there would be distance between him and the firm that drafted it." "That's what the timeline suggests," Natalia said carefully. "I'm not in a position to—" "I know you're not." Vivian held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to confirm it legally. I'm just thinking." She was doing more than thinking. She was experiencing something that she recognized after a moment as the sensation of a structure she had trusted. Not Adrian, she had stopped trusting Adrian, but the structure of her own preparation, the 3 years of careful and methodical groundwork, developing a crack she had not anticipated. She had thought she had examined everything. She had not examined what had been hidden before she knew she needed to look. "Can it be challenged?" she asked. "The amendment?" Natalia turned to her associate's notes. "Potentially, yes. The signature can be forensically examined. If it can be demonstrated that the document was presented to you under conditions that did not constitute genuine informed consent, buried in a stack, misrepresented, signed without your full understanding of the provision, we have grounds." She paused. "It would take time." "How much time?" "If they move to invoke the provision, we'd be in litigation over the amendment's validity while the governance review is suspended. Realistically, we're talking about 6 to 9 months before the review can resume, assuming we prevail." 6 to 9 months. She thought about the momentum, the witnesses who had come forward, Daniel Holt's statement, the preliminary finding, the financial press that was now paying attention. She thought about the way momentum works in a public situation. It has a life of its own, and when you interrupt it, when you force it into a procedural pause, it does not simply wait for you. It dissipates. Witnesses have their own lives. Journalists move to the next story. Board members who are waiting to see which way things resolve start hedging towards safety. She thought about Natalia's voice on the phone 25 minutes ago. She thought about Adrian, in the cafe, 23 minutes before that, telling her he had stood down the settlement offer, telling her the non-disclosure component was wrong, telling her she was right. Something very cold and very precise moved through her. "The meeting with Adrian today," she said. Natalia waited. "He told me he was withdrawing the settlement offer, the one with the non-disclosure." She looked at Natalia. "He told me he knew it was wrong." "Yes." "And 2 hours later, this arrives from the review committee's counsel." Natalia's expression did not change. She was too experienced to let it change, but her stillness was its own response. "He knew this was coming," Vivian said. "He met with me today knowing that by this evening I would find out about the provision. He sat across from me and told me what I needed to hear, what would make me believe he was finally ready to be honest, right before I found out that he had insulated himself legally years ago." She paused. "He was managing me." "Vivian, tell me I'm wrong." Natalia looked at the folder on the table between them. "I can't tell you you're wrong." She breathed out slowly through her nose. She had been wrong about the clarity of what she was doing. She had believed, with a confidence she now recognized as the confidence of someone who had not fully accounted for the intelligence of the person they were dealing with, that her preparation had been thorough enough to make the outcome relatively clean. Adrian had spent 15 years watching how she thought. He understood how she organized information. He understood how she built a case. He had seen her do it, repeatedly, in high-stakes situations where the outcome had mattered enormously. He had presented her work as his own in public while, in private, absorbing the method of it, the architecture of it, the way her mind moved when she was making something airtight. He had used what he learned from watching her to construct a defense against her. The clarity she had felt was real. The preparation was real. The evidence was real. And Marcus Ellison's letter was real. And Daniel Holt's testimony was real. But Adrian had been preparing too. And he was not stupid. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood with her back to Natalia, looking down at the street 31 floors below, where people moved in the ordinary patterns of an afternoon that had no idea what was happening in this room. She needed to think. Not about the legal strategy. Natalia would work the legal strategy. That was Natalia's terrain, and she was extremely good at it. She needed to think about something else, something beneath the legal layer. She had built this entire process on a foundation of documentation and evidence and corporate governance procedure. She had been deliberate about keeping it in that register precisely because it was unimpeachable in that register. Facts were facts. Documents were documents. The work was real and the record of it was real. But a provision buried in an amendment could turn a question of fact into a question of procedure. And a question of procedure could take 6 to 9 months. And in 6 to 9 months, a great many things that were currently in motion could stop moving. She turned around. "There's something else we can do," she said. Natalia looked at her. The Morrison financial dinner. It was 6 weeks away. She had been aware of it as a peripheral item on the horizon, something that existed in the timeline of the broader situation without yet having a specific role in it. Adrian is scheduled to speak. Yes. Who controls the program? Natalia was quiet for a moment, processing the direction of the question. Edward Morrison himself curates it. It's his family foundation. I know Edward Morrison. She said it without elaboration because the elaboration was complex and the relevant part was simple. She knew him well enough, and he knew her well enough, and there was a history between them that had nothing to do with Adrian. What are you thinking? Natalia asked. Vivian looked at her. I'm thinking that if a legal provision can freeze the formal process, then the formal process cannot be the only process. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. The governance review was never the whole strategy. It was one part of it. She paused. I've been so focused on the document trail that I've been neglecting the thing the document trail was always supposed to lead to, which is the room. She said it simply. The room where the decisions were made, where the people are who always knew the truth but found it convenient not to say so out loud. She looked at Natalia. The Morrison dinner puts every one of those people in the same place at the same time, and Adrian is going to stand at a podium and tell them a story about how he built something. She buttoned her coat. I'm going to be in that room, she said. Natalia was quiet for a long moment. Her expression held the particular combination of professional calculation and something less professional, something that might, in a different context, have been called respect. If Adrian's team finds out you're planning to attend, then they find out. Vivian picked up her bag. He spent 15 years making me invisible in rooms I helped build. I'm done being invisible. She walked to the door and then stopped, one hand on the frame, without turning around. Find out what's on the program, she said, and call Robert Ellison. Tell him I'd like to know whether his father ever attended the Morrison dinner, and if so, whether Edward Morrison knew him well. She did not wait for Natalia's response. She walked out into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and stood in the quiet fluorescent light of the 31st floor, her jaw set, her breathing controlled, one hand in her coat pocket where her fingers found the small familiar shapes of her mother's earrings. She had made a mistake, not the decision to act, that had never been a mistake, but the belief that the action could be clean, could be purely procedural, could be won in the register of documents and evidence alone. She had allowed herself to believe that the truth, properly organized and properly presented, would move through the world frictionlessly. It did not move frictionlessly. It moved the way everything moved, through people, through rooms, through the accumulated weight of what people were willing to say out loud when they were standing in the right place at the right time, surrounded by people who needed to hear it. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside and watched the doors close and saw her own face in the brushed steel of the elevator wall. Composed, severe, a jaw that people called severe. And she made a decision that she had been approaching for weeks without fully articulating. The decision that changed the nature of what she was doing. She had entered this process as a woman presenting evidence. She was going to finish it as a woman reclaiming her name. The elevator began to descend, and 31 floors below, the city received her. The 6 weeks between the elevator and the Morrison financial dinner were the most concentrated period of work in Vivian Caldwell's adult life, and she had spent her adult life working at a level that most people could not sustain for a month. She did not think of them as 6 weeks. She thought of them as a series of problems, each with a specific solution, each requiring a specific kind of attention. And she moved through them the way she had always moved through complex situations, sequentially, without wasted motion, sleeping 5 hours a night, and eating at her desk and filling her notebook with the dense compressed shorthand that was legible only to her. The forensic examination of her signature on the amendment came back in the 3rd week. The report was 40 pages, and Natalia walked her through it in 2 hours on a Tuesday morning, methodical and precise, translating the technical language of handwriting analysis and document examination into plain terms. The conclusion was qualified. Forensic document analysis always was. But the qualifications pointed in a specific direction. The signature on the amendment showed characteristics consistent with the document signed in the presence of multiple other documents, signed quickly, signed without the signer reading the specific page. The ink pressure was lighter than Vivian's signature on comparable documents from the same period. The angle of her name was slightly off from her established pattern, the way a person's signature drifts when they are signing something as part of a stack rather than as a single document demanding attention. It was not proof of fraud, but it was evidence of something less than genuine informed consent. Natalia filed a challenge to the amendment's enforceability on a Wednesday. Adrian's team responded on Friday. The legal argument that followed was dense and technical and moved with the particular velocity of a dispute that both sides knew was preliminary. Not the fight itself, but the positioning before the fight. In the meantime, the provision remained in a state of contested limbo. The governance review was not formally suspended because Natalia had argued successfully that suspension required the provision to be declared valid first, and validity was precisely what was being contested. But the review's momentum was arrested. The committee council was waiting for the legal question to resolve before proceeding to the full findings. This was what Adrian's team had wanted. Vivian understood this and used the understanding to fuel something she would not have called anger. Anger was too blunt, too hot, too likely to make her imprecise, but which served the same purpose anger served in a person who was built differently. It made her faster. It made her sharper. It made her willing to do things she might otherwise have approached more cautiously. She called Edward Morrison on a Thursday evening in the 4th week. She had not spoken to Edward in 3 years, not because the relationship had ended, but because the relationship lived in a specific context, the world of high-level financial philanthropy and institutional investment where their paths had intersected over a decade. And that world had receded from her direct life during the later years of her marriage in ways she had not fully registered until now. Edward answered on the 2nd ring, which told her he had seen her name on his phone and had chosen to pick up quickly. This was also information. "Vivian Caldwell," he said. His voice was what it had always been. Warm, gravel-edged, the voice of a man in his early 70s who had smoked for 30 years and stopped 20 years ago, but still carried the evidence of it. "I wondered when you'd call." "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask?" "The Morrison dinner. I'd like to attend." A pause. Not hesitation. Edward Morrison did not hesitate. It was one of the things she respected about him. But the pause of a man choosing the right weight for his words. "Adrian is speaking this year." "I know. His team confirmed the speaking slot 8 weeks ago." "I know that too." Another pause. "You understand what you'd be walking into." "Yes." "The room is going to read it a specific way." I know what the room will read it as, she said. I'm asking you if I can be there. Not to disrupt the program. Not to make a scene. I want to attend as a guest. The silence on the other end was longer this time. She waited in it without filling it, because she had learned from 20 years of negotiation that the person who fills silence first is usually the person who needs something more than the other person does. And she needed this, but she was not going to let the need show in her voice. Marcus came every year for 30 years, Edward said finally. You know that. Yes. He talked about you, more than once. Told me you were the most precise strategic mind he'd encountered in a generation. A pause. He also told me that the industry had a serious problem with making certain people invisible. Another pause. He wasn't talking about himself. She stood at the window of the West Village apartment with the phone held against her ear and the city doing its indifferent evening thing outside, and she said, Will you have me as a guest? I'll have you as a guest, Edward Morrison said. And Vivian, wear something that makes you impossible to overlook. She thanked him and ended the call and stood in the quiet for a long moment. Then she went back to her notebook. The Morrison Financial Dinner was held on a Friday evening in the grand ballroom of a hotel in Midtown that had been hosting significant events for 80 years and which understood, with the institutional confidence of old money, that its function was to provide a container for the things that mattered and then to disappear into the background. 340 people attended. Vivian knew, by name and professional history, approximately 260 of them. She arrived alone, which was a choice. Natalia had offered to accompany her, and she had declined. What she was doing tonight was not legal strategy and did not benefit from a legal presence at her shoulder. She was also aware, with the precise social intelligence that 15 years of operating in these rooms had developed in her, that arriving alone communicated something specific. It communicated that she needed no one else's authority, that she was her own context. She wore black, not as mourning and not as drama. Black because it was what she wore when she wanted the attention to go to her face and her posture and her hands, and not to what she was wearing. The earrings were her mother's emeralds. She had put them on that afternoon and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror of the apartment for approximately 3 seconds, which was all the self-examination she permitted herself on significant evenings. And then she had gone to get her coat. The moment she walked through the ballroom doors, she felt the room change. Not dramatically, not with gasps or a visible ripple. In these rooms, among these people, reactions were contained by professional habit and social training. But she had spent enough years in enough rooms like this one to read the temperature of a room the way a musician reads a key change. Something in the air shifted, a subtle collective adjustment, and she registered it and walked forward without altering her pace. People approached her. This was not what she had expected, or not exactly. She had expected acknowledgement, the careful diplomatic acknowledgement of people who were watching a situation and wanted to be seen as choosing the right side without committing themselves too early. What she got instead was warmer than that. Board members she had not spoken to in weeks. Investors who had known her for years and whose professional respect had always been present but quietly operated. A woman named Clara Bridges, who ran one of the largest pension funds in the Northeast and who had sat across from Vivian in meetings without ever publicly acknowledging the intelligence of what Vivian was doing, because the meeting was always framed as Adrian's meeting, and the protocols of those meetings made acknowledgement complicated. Clara took her hand with both of hers. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. Vivian moved through the room. She was at the bar, accepting a glass of water when she saw Adrian. He saw her at the same moment. He was standing 30 feet away with 2 men she recognized as significant investors, mid-conversation, and the conversation stopped. The 2 investors followed his gaze. They saw her. One of them said something that she couldn't hear. Adrian did not respond to it. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not in 15 years of marriage, not in the weeks of legal combat, not in the cafe on 23rd Street where he had told her she was right. It was the expression of a man who has just understood that the situation is larger than he calculated. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned to the bartender and asked for still water and turned to the person beside her, who was a fund manager she had met at a similar event 8 years ago, and she asked him how the year had been. Dinner was served at round tables of 10. She had been seated, by Edward's arrangement, at a table that included Helen Cho and Paul Ryder from the Whitmore Board, Robert Ellison, Clara Bridges, and 4 other people whose names and positions she knew and who knew hers. The table conversation was careful at first, the careful conversation of people at a dinner who are aware of the significance of their proximity to each other. But it loosened as the meal progressed, and by the second course it had become something else. Direct, substantive, the kind of conversation that happens when the people having it are all sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently tired of performing that they allow themselves to simply say things. Helen Cho said, at one point, to the table in general, "The governance review preliminary findings are strong. Whatever the legal delay looks like right now, the findings don't disappear." "Legal delay is the strategy," Robert Ellison said. He was younger than most people at the table, mid-40s, with his father's directness and a manner that had not yet fully hardened into the diplomatic coding of his generation. "It's buying time for the narrative to be rewritten." "It won't be rewritten," Clara Bridges said. She said it with a flat certainty that was not bravado, but simply the assessment of a woman who had watched the financial industry manage narratives for 40 years and understood their shelf life. She looked at Vivian. "The thing about documentation is that it waits." Vivian looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's what I've been counting on." Across the room, she could see Adrian at his table. He was performing the dinner correctly, talking, laughing at the right moments, presenting the version of himself that these rooms had always received well. But he checked the distance between them 3 times during the first course, and she noted each check without looking at him directly, the way you can monitor a thing in your peripheral vision without granting it the dignity of your full attention. The program began at 9. Edward Morrison spoke first, as he always did. Brief, precise, the remarks of a man who understood that an event like this one did not need to be narrated, only framed. He spoke about the Foundation's work, about the meaning of the dinner in the context of the industry it served, and then he said something that was not on any program she had been shown. "This room is always operated on the principle that what matters most is what is actually true," Edward said from the podium. "Not what is convenient, not what is polished for public presentation. What is actually true about how things were built and who built them." He paused. He did not look at any specific person in the room, which was itself a choice. "This year I want to acknowledge that we have not always honored that principle as well as we should have, and that acknowledging it is not weakness. It is the only thing that makes the work we do here worth continuing." The room was very quiet. Then he said, "I'm going to deviate slightly from our scheduled program this evening. Before our primary speaker, I'd like to invite someone to say a few words. Someone whose contribution to this industry's landscape has been significant and has not been adequately recognized in rooms like this one." He looked up. Vivian Caldwell. The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then the room began to move. Not chaotically, but with the particular quality of 340 people recalibrating simultaneously. Vivian set her water glass down. She had not been told about this. She was certain of this because she would have prepared differently if she had been told, and she was not prepared. Her notebook was in her bag. She had no remarks. She had nothing except what she had been carrying for 15 years, which was, it turned out, enough. She stood up. The walk from her table to the podium took approximately 30 seconds, and she used every one of them to think about what she was going to say, not in the sense of scripting it, but in the sense of finding the center of it, the true thing she wanted to say, the thing that would still be true tomorrow and next year and in whatever time came after this. She stood at the podium. The room looked back at her. 340 people. Helen Cho and Paul Ryder at her table. Robert Ellison sitting forward slightly, Clara Bridges with her hands folded in her lap, Adrian, 30 feet to her left, who was not looking at her the way everyone else was looking at her. He was looking at the table in front of him, and his jaw was set, and his hands, she could see from here, were very still. She pulled the microphone down to her height. "I'll be brief," she said. Her voice came out level and clear, which she registered with a distant relief because she had not been certain it would. "I've been coming to events like this one for 15 years, she said. "I came to most of them beside someone else. I was introduced as an appendage of his work rather than a person with my own. I found this frustrating, and I managed the frustration by doing the work more carefully, because I believed for a long time that quality was its own argument. She paused. It isn't. Quality is a necessary condition. It is not sufficient. The room was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. The work I contributed to Whitmore Capital over 15 years is documented, she said. The governance review currently underway will conclude what anyone who is paying attention already knows. I'm not here to argue that case tonight. I'm here because there is something that documents cannot do. She looked out at the room. Documents can prove what happened. They cannot say why it matters. Another pause. It matters because the invisible work of invisible people is not a personal problem. It's an industry problem. And industries do not fix problems they refuse to see. She stepped back from the microphone. The applause that followed was not the polite applause of an audience fulfilling a social obligation. It built from specific places in the room. Helen chose hands first, then Clara Bridges, then Robert Ellison, then spreading. And it had the quality of something that had been accumulating pressure and was finally releasing. She walked back to her table. She did not look at Adrian. He found her 20 minutes later near the far end of the room, where the large windows looked out at the midtown skyline. The program had moved on. People were moving between tables. The room had a different temperature than it had 40 minutes ago. He came up beside her and stood there for a moment before he spoke. "You didn't know he was going to call you up," he said. "No." "You had nothing prepared." "No." He absorbed this. She could feel him beside her, the specific physical presence of him that 15 years had made as familiar as the sound of her own footsteps, and she was aware that this was one of the last times she would be standing close enough to him to feel it. "I'm going to cooperate with the review," he said, "fully. I spoke to Greer tonight before dinner. We're withdrawing the challenge to the amendment." She turned to look at him. His face in the dim light from the windows was older than the face she had married. This was obvious. And also, in the moment, arresting. The way time appears suddenly on a face you know well, not gradually, but all at once, as if it had been accumulating somewhere you couldn't see and had decided to be visible tonight. "Why?" she said. Not a challenge, a genuine question. "Because I listened to what you said up there." He looked at the window. "And because I've been listening to the wrong version of events for so long that I almost couldn't find the right one anymore." A pause. "I don't want to be the man who buried Marcus Ellison's letter. I don't want to be the man who challenged a signature in court." He turned to look at her. "I already am those things. I can't undo them. But I don't have to keep being them." She looked at him for a long moment. She was looking for the strategy in it. She could not find one, and she was very good at finding strategies. This was either genuine or it was the most sophisticated performance she had ever encountered from him, and she had been present for some extraordinary performances. She decided to treat it as genuine, not because she was certain, but because the alternative, assuming everything was manipulation until proven otherwise, was a way of living that she was no longer willing to sustain. "The review will find what it finds," she said. "Cooperating doesn't change that." "I know. The record will be corrected regardless." "I know that too." "Then why does it matter that you're cooperating?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I want to be on the right side of it, even now, even this late." He paused. "That probably doesn't mean much to you." "It means something," she said. "I'm not sure yet what." They stood in front of the windows and the city blazed beyond the glass, indifferent and continuous and enormous in the way that cities are enormous when you are standing inside something small and human and irreversible. "I owe you more than a corrected record," he said. "Yes. I know I can't, Adrian." She said his name with a finality that was not unkind. "Don't. Not tonight." He nodded. She turned away from the window and from him and began to move back toward the center of the room, and as she moved, she felt the room receive her differently than it ever had before. Not as Adrian Whitmore's wife, not as the woman behind the strategy, not as the quiet presence in rooms that loudly belonged to someone else. She felt it receive her as herself. And then, from across the room, she saw Paul Ryder moving toward her with purpose, and beside him was a woman she recognized as the chief counsel of the Governance Review Committee, and the expression on both their faces was the expression of people who have just received information and need to deliver it. And something in the set of Paul's jaw told her that what they were carrying was not bad news. She stopped and waited for them to reach her, her mother's earrings warm against her neck, her heart doing something in her chest that was not quite calm and not quite fear, but was fully, completely alive. And Paul Ryder reached her and opened his mouth to speak and said, "Vivian, the committee convened an emergency session this evening." Paul Ryder said, "Vivian, the committee convened an emergency session this evening. They voted on the preliminary findings." She looked at him. Beside him, the chief counsel of the Governance Review Committee, a woman named Sandra Okafor, whom Vivian had met twice, both times briefly, both times in rooms that smelled of paper and fluorescent light, was holding a leather portfolio against her chest with both arms, the posture of someone carrying something they are not yet certain how to put down. The vote was unanimous, Paul said. The noise of the dinner continued around them. Someone laughed at a nearby table. A waiter moved past with a tray. The ordinary machinery of a room full of people who did not know what was being said. In this corner of it went on turning. "Tell me what that means specifically," Vivian said. Sandra Okafor opened her portfolio. She was a precise woman, methodical, the kind of attorney who communicated in document language even when speaking aloud. The committee has voted to validate the preliminary findings and move immediately to formal adoption, bypassing the standard additional review period. The basis for expedited adoption is the volume and quality of evidence submitted, which the committee determined was sufficient for conclusive finding without further delay. She looked up from the page. The finding formally recognizes Vivian Caldwell as a primary strategic architect of Whitmore Capital during the period under review. It corrects the public record maintained by the company, and it establishes that her 38% ownership stake carries full governance authority, the enforceability of which the committee finds is not materially affected by the contested amendment on the grounds that the amendment was procedurally deficient at the time of signing. Vivian breathed in slowly through her nose. "The challenge Adrian's team filed this afternoon," she said, "is rendered moot by the committee's finding," Sandra said. "The finding operates at the corporate governance level, not the contractual level. His team can still pursue the contractual argument, but it no longer has the effect of suspending the governance outcome." Paul Ryder was watching her. Helen Cho had appeared at his shoulder at some point in the last 30 seconds, and she was watching too, with the careful attention of a board member who understood that the next few minutes were going to require someone to make a decision. "What does the board need from me?" Vivian asked. "A formal acceptance of the governance authority," Helen said, "and a decision about how you want to proceed in that capacity." She paused. "There will need to be a board meeting within the week. Schedule it." "Vivian," Helen stopped. "Then, are you all right?" The question was genuinely meant. Helen Cho was not a woman who asked questions to fill space. Vivian thought about it honestly, which was something she had trained herself to do, to actually answer the question rather than produce the answer that was most convenient. She had been standing in this room for 2 hours. She had walked to a podium without preparation and said true things in front of 340 people. She had stood at a window with the man she was divorcing and had something with him that was not forgiveness and was not closure, but was perhaps the beginning of the long, difficult work of accurately understanding what the 15 years had actually been. And she had just been told that the process she had spent 3 years building had concluded, tonight, in this room, with a unanimous vote. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again tomorrow." Helen nodded. It was the right answer, and they both knew it. She found a quiet corner of the room near the exit corridor, a small alcove with 2 chairs that were not being used, and she sat down and put her bag on the second chair and looked at the ballroom from that vantage point for a while. She could see Adrian from here. He was standing with Greer, who had apparently arrived at some point during the program, and the conversation between them had the specific body language of an attorney delivering information that his client did not want to receive. Greer's posture was controlled. Adrian's was not. His shoulders had the set of a man who is working very hard not to show that something has just impacted him physically. Greer would have told him about the committee vote. She watched Adrian receive this information from a distance, and she felt something that she took a moment to identify, because it was not what she would have predicted. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in the conventional sense. It was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a weight that has been carried for a very long time being set down, and the awareness, which arrives always after the setting down and never before, of how heavy it actually was. Robert Ellison appeared beside her. He sat down in the chair that didn't have her bag on it, and he looked at the room with her for a moment before he spoke. "My father would have been pleased," he said. "Tell me about him," she said. Not because she didn't know Marcus Ellison, but because she wanted to hear his son talk about him. There was a version of Marcus she knew professionally, intellectually, in the compressed and purposeful context of rooms like this one. There was a version only Robert knew. Robert thought about it. He had his father's deliberateness. He hated waste, he said finally. Not material waste. He could be extremely generous with material things. He hated the waste of good thinking that went unacknowledged. He said it was the most expensive thing the industry did, chronically, and without any awareness of the cost. He paused. He talked about you specifically, more than once. He said you were an example of exactly that waste, and that it bothered him every time he was in a room where your work was being attributed to someone else. She looked at her hands. He never said anything, she said. In those rooms. No. Robert was quiet for a moment. He told me that he regretted that. He said he told himself it wasn't his place to intervene in someone else's professional arrangement, that you were a grown woman with your own agency and your own choices. Another pause. He said he was wrong about that silence in those situations is not neutrality, it's participation. The words landed somewhere specific. She sat with them. He's right, she said. He usually was. It was irritating. A small pause. He would have wanted to be here tonight. I know. He would have clapped louder than anyone in the room. She smiled. It was a small smile, and it arrived without warning, which was its own kind of relief. To find that the thing in her still worked, that the machinery of genuine response had not been worn down to nothing by the past months. Thank you, she said, for calling me, for the letter. It was the right thing, Robert said simply. They sat together for a few more minutes, not talking, watching the room begin to turn toward its conclusion. She was putting on her coat in the lobby when Adrian found her. He came through the ballroom doors alone, without Greer, which meant he had made a choice to come and had not wanted the attorney's presence to complicate whatever he intended to say. She had her coat on and her bag over one shoulder, and she looked at him and waited. He looked exhausted. Not the performance of exhaustion, actually exhausted, in the way that a person looks when the last structure they were leaning against has been removed, and they are discovering whether they can stand without it. The committee voted, he said. I know. Greer told me. He put his hands in his pockets. The lobby was quiet, most of the dinner's guests still inside, the sound of it muffled behind the ballroom doors. He also told me we have no grounds to challenge the finding at the corporate level. The contractual argument is still technically available, but... He stopped. But pursuing it would be, wrong, she said. He looked at her. Yes. Then don't pursue it. I'm not going to. He said it simply, not as a negotiating position, not as a concession offered in exchange for something, simply as a statement of what he was going to do. She studied him. The lobby light was unflattering, the overhead light of a place designed for movement, and not for the kind of stillness they were standing in, and it showed everything on his face that the ballroom's warmer light had partially concealed. He looked like a man who had come to the end of something and was standing at that end without knowing yet what came next. You're going to have to make a public statement, she said. The board will need one, and the press will need one. Whatever Greer advises you to say, I'd suggest something different. What? The truth. She said it without drama. Not the legal minimum version of it, the actual truth about the company's history and who contributed to it. It will be harder in the short term, and it will be the only thing that actually holds in the long term. He absorbed this. You're still advising me. Old habit. A silence. You are my most important sounding board, he said. He said it slowly, with the weight of a man who is finally understanding the full measure of what a sentence costs. That's what I told the journalist. Yes. I've been thinking about that phrase since you said it to me outside the cafe. He looked at the floor briefly. A sounding board. Something you use, something that receives what you direct at it and sends it back shaped correctly. He looked up. You weren't that. You were never that. No, she said. I made you that. By calling you that. By using that word in a public context where it was the only word that would appear next to your name. He paused. I reduced 15 years of partnership to furniture. The word arrived cleanly. Furniture. She had not used that word even in her own private accounting of what had happened, but hearing it from him, in his voice, with the full weight of what it meant, she felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was still holding tight. Yes, she said. You did. I'm sorry. The apology was not elaborate. It was not accompanied by the machinery of justification or the performance of emotion. It was 2 words spoken by a tired man in a lobby at the end of a night that had cost both of them something real, and it was the most honest thing she had heard from him in longer than she could accurately measure. She looked at him for a long time. I know, she said. Not, I forgive you. Not, it's all right. Because it was not all right, and forgiving was a longer process than one evening in a hotel lobby, and she was not going to offer him a resolution she hadn't actually reached. But I know, which was true, which acknowledged the apology for what it was, genuine, insufficient, and necessary. He nodded. She walked toward the exit. Vivian. She stopped, did not turn around. What you said up there tonight, his voice came from behind her, quiet in the empty lobby. It was, I've seen you speak in rooms for 15 years. I've watched you handle situations that would have broken most people. I've watched you do things in the background of this company that saved it, more than once. A pause. I never said that publicly. In 15 years, I never once stood up in a room like this and said what you actually were. She stood at the exit with her coat on and her bag on her shoulder and her mother's earrings warm at her neck. I know, she said again. Same 2 words, different weight. Then she pushed through the door and the night air of the city came at her, cold and clear and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside that building. And she walked into it. Well, the board meeting was on Wednesday. It lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was long but not extraordinary given the density of what needed to be covered. Vivian sat at the conference table, not at the end where Adrian usually sat, but at the position she had been allocated as the newly recognized governing stakeholder, which was to his left, which meant she spent the meeting in her peripheral vision of him and he in hers. The full governance finding was entered into the official record of the company. The company's historical documentation would be updated to reflect accurate attribution of strategic contribution. The press release that Greer and Natalia had spent 4 days negotiating, line by line, was approved by the board in its final form. The press release did not use the word furniture. It used careful corporate language to describe a re-examination of the historical record and to acknowledge significant contributions that had not been previously reflected in the company's public materials. It named Vivian Caldwell. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it would be read by the people who needed to read it, with full understanding of what it meant. When the board voted to approve the release, the vote was unanimous. Adrian voted yes. She noted this without looking at him. It was significant, and it was also at this point the minimum of what accuracy required. Both of these things could be true simultaneously. After the meeting, she stayed in the conference room while the others filtered out. She sat at the table alone for a few minutes, in the particular silence of a room that has just held something large, and from which the largeness is now departing. Natalia came back in and sat down beside her. They had been through a great deal together in the past months. Natalia was not a woman given to sentiment, which was one of the reasons Vivian had chosen her. But she sat beside Vivian with the ease of someone who has earned proximity and knows it. It's done, Natalia said. The divorce still has 2 months. The legal work, yes, but the other thing, Natalia paused, choosing. The thing you actually needed to do. That's done. Vivian looked at the conference table. Someone had left a pen near the center of it, uncapped. Small detail. The kind of thing that gets left when a room empties quickly. It doesn't feel the way I expected it to feel, she said. What did you expect? I don't know, something cleaner. She paused. It feels accurate. It feels like the record is now correct, but it doesn't feel triumphant isn't the right word. It doesn't feel resolved the way a proof resolves. It feels more like... She stopped. Like the beginning of something, Natalia said. Yes. Natalia picked up her files. That's because it is. The Greenwich house sold in late November. She was not present for the closing. She had signed her documents 3 days earlier in Natalia's office on a Tuesday afternoon in the flat gray light of an autumn that had turned cold quickly. The documents were straightforward. The division was equitable and had been arrived at without the extended combat that both their legal teams had, at various points, prepared for. Adrian had been, in the end, willing to be fair. She did not know whether this was genuine change or strategic calculation, and she had decided, in the interest of her own continued functioning, to treat the distinction as unimportant. The money from the sale was not what she was thinking about. She was thinking about the kitchen, which she had used every morning for 9 years, despite never feeling that the house was hers. About the garden in autumn, which had been planted by the previous owners and which bloomed every April with the indifferent reliability of things that do not know they are beautiful. About the guest room where she had slept on the night she came home from Geneva to find her mother's earrings on another woman's ears. She did not miss any of it, but she noted the catalog of it with the honesty that she had decided, somewhere in the past months, to apply to everything, including the things that had no strategic relevance and were simply part of what had been. The new office opened in the first week of December. It was smaller than the offices she had occupied during the Whitmore years, which was a choice. It was on the 8th floor of a building in the Flatiron district, with south-facing windows and exposed brick on one wall, and a conference room with a glass door that she could leave open or closed, depending on what the day required. She had furnished it herself, which she had not done since her late 20s, and she had been surprised by how specific her preferences turned out to be. Not expensive, not designed for impression, but particular in the way of things chosen by someone who has decided that their environment should reflect what they actually like rather than what they are supposed to like. Her name was on the door. Not Caldwell Whitmore, not Mrs. Adrian Whitmore, not any formulation that located her in relation to someone else. Vivian Caldwell Strategic Advisory. Her name, full, unqualified, in sans serif letters on a frosted glass panel beside the door. She stood in front of it on the morning it was installed, and she looked at it for a long time. Long enough that her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had previously worked at one of the large institutional investors and who had called Vivian directly, without intermediary, to ask for the job, came to stand beside her and look at it too. "It's good," Priya said. "Yes," Vivian said. "It is." Clara Bridges called on the second Tuesday of December. She called on Vivian's direct line, not through Priya, which meant she had gotten the number specifically. Clara was not a woman who made casual calls. When she called, she had something to say. "I want to discuss a mandate," Clara said. "A significant one. I've been looking at a restructuring situation that my current advisory relationships aren't positioned to handle well. I need someone who understands the architecture of a deal from the inside." A pause. "I also want to say something before we discuss business." "Go ahead." "I sat across from you in rooms for 6 years and I didn't do what I should have done. I knew what you were doing and I said nothing, publicly, that acknowledged it. I told myself it wasn't my place." Clara's voice was measured, but she had the directness of someone who has decided that a thing needs to be said and is saying it. "I was wrong. And I'm aware that doing business with you now is not the same as having done the right thing then." Vivian was standing at the south-facing window of her new office, one hand holding the phone, the other resting on the window frame. Outside, the city was doing its December thing. Gray sky, the pulse of traffic, people moving on the street below with the particular purposeful urgency of people who are cold and have somewhere to be. "I appreciate you saying that," Vivian said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She paused. "Tell me about the restructuring." They talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, they had agreed to meet the following week. Vivian made notes on the legal pad on her desk. Not the notebook she had been filling for 3 years, which was full, which she had put in the bottom drawer of her desk in the West Village apartment as the closest thing she had to an archive. but a new legal pad, clean, with the first page still white. After the call, she sat at her desk and looked at her notes. She was aware that what was beginning now was not a second act, not in the theatrical sense of recovery and redemption that stories often imposed on the aftermath of what she had been through. It was not simpler than what came before. It was not lighter. It was, if anything, more exposed, because she was operating now without the structural cover of a large institution, without the resources of Whitmore Capital, without the particular kind of invisibility that had, for all its damage, also provided a certain protection. She was going to make mistakes. She was going to work with people who disappointed her and situations that did not resolve cleanly. She was going to have bad quarters and difficult clients, and days when the new office felt very small against the scale of what she was attempting. She knew all of this. What she also knew, what the past 8 months had given her, had extracted from her at a cost she was still tallying, was the difference between building something in your own name and building something in another person's shadow. She knew what both felt like in the body. She knew which one allowed sleep. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late January in a courtroom on Center Street that had the institutional gray of all such rooms, fluorescent and impartial. Their attorneys signed what needed to be signed. The judge reviewed and approved. It took 22 minutes. Adrian was present. They did not speak in the courtroom. Afterward, in the corridor outside, they stood for a moment in the particular liminal space of two people who have just formally concluded 15 years. He looked better than he had at the Morrison dinner. Not fully rested, she suspected neither of them was sleeping fully yet, that the adjustment to a new architecture of daily life required time that could not be hurried, but less hollowed out. He had made the public statement that accuracy required. He had cooperated with the final stages of the governance review. He was running the company in the context of a corrected historical record, which had proven, as she had told him it would, more durable than the previous version. The stock had stabilized. The institutional investors who had watched the situation carefully had for the most part found the resolution credible precisely because it had not been managed into convenient simplicity. He had done the right things. She was not going to love him for that, but she was not going to deny it either. "How's the new office?" he said. "Good. I heard Clara Bridges brought you a mandate." "You heard quickly." "I still know people." A pause. The corridor was quiet, a few clerks moving past without interest. "Is it a good one?" "Significant restructuring situation." "Yes." He nodded. There was a moment that could have been filled with something larger, something the weight of the occasion seemed to call for, and they both felt it and both let it pass, because they had said the things that needed saying in the months between then and now. And what remained was not unsaid things, but simply the fact of what was. Two people who had shared something real and had arrived, through damage and difficulty and a great deal of legal paper, at a place that was accurate. "I hope it goes well," he said. And he meant it. She could tell that he meant it with the same completeness with which she could tell 15 years ago, when he hadn't. "Thank you," she said. She walked toward the elevator. She did not look back. This was not for dramatic effect and not from coldness. She did not look back because there was nothing behind her now that she had not already fully seen, fully accounted for, and set down with both hands. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. There is a moment in the late afternoon of a December day when the light in New York City does something specific. It comes in low and amber and sideways through the gaps between buildings, and it catches on surfaces that are ordinarily just surfaces, a window, a stretch of sidewalk, the glass face of a building, and it makes them briefly extraordinary. It doesn't last. 5 minutes, sometimes less. But in those 5 minutes, the city looks like it is lit from the inside. Vivian was standing outside her building on a Thursday in late January when this happened, in a coat she had chosen herself, with her bag over one shoulder and a legal pad under her arm covered in the first notes of a new project. She was standing still for no specific reason, just standing, which was not something she did often. She was a person of forward motion, of the next task, of the notebook and the legal pad and the problem being solved. But she was standing still in the amber light of a late afternoon, and she was not thinking about the governance review, or the corrected record, or the restructuring mandate, or the divorce decree that was now a document in Natalia's files. She was thinking about her mother, about a woman who had stood in front of mathematics classrooms for 31 years and taught young people to think rigorously about the world, who had worn small emerald earrings every day, who had believed with a steadiness that never wavered that the most important thing a person could develop was the capacity for clear and honest thought. She put her hand to her left ear and felt the small, warm weight of the earring there. Eleanor Caldwell had not accumulated wealth. She had not built an empire. She had not had her name on a building or a foundation or a press release. She had stood in front of rooms full of young people for 31 years and given them something they could use, and most of them had moved on into their lives and used it without thinking very much about where it came from. She had not seemed to mind. This was the part of her mother that Vivian had always found most difficult to understand and most necessary to learn from. The equanimity of a person who does good work without requiring the work to be witnessed, who finds the work itself sufficient, who does not measure the value of what she has done by whether anyone is looking. Vivian had spent 15 years waiting to be seen. She was not going to spend the next 15 waiting for anything. The light shifted and the amber was gone, absorbed back into the ordinary gray of the afternoon, and the city resumed its usual appearance of surfaces that are just surfaces, and the people on the sidewalk moved past her without slowing. She picked up her bag more firmly on her shoulder, adjusted the legal pad under her arm. She had a call in 30 minutes with a new client who had been referred by Clara Bridges, a firm navigating a complex multi-party acquisition that needed someone who could see the architecture of the thing from the inside out. She had read the preliminary documents that morning, and she had already found 3 things that no one else had caught, which was satisfying in the particular way that competence is satisfying. Not triumphant, not dramatic, simply the clean feeling of a mind doing what it does well. She walked back into her building. The elevator took her to the 8th floor. Her name was on the door. She opened it and went inside and sat down at her desk and picked up her pen, and the city blazed beyond the south-facing windows, enormous and continuous and entirely indifferent to the question of whether anyone was paying attention. And she began.